The morning of May 17, 1943, over the IJmuiden naval base in occupied Holland, Technical Sergeant Robert Watts crouched behind the twin 50 caliber machine guns mounted in the tail position of a B-26 Marauder named Flak Bait. Through the cramped plexiglass bubble that served as his entire world, at 12,000 feet, he watched three Focke-Wulf 190 fighters break formation and turn toward his aircraft. The German pilots had likely heard the rumors circulating through Luftwaffe squadrons along the Channel coast. American crews called their own aircraft the Widowmaker. They crashed during training at rates that had grounded the entire fleet twice. They required experienced pilots and unforgiving approach speeds. Surely, the Germans reasoned, such a troubled aircraft would prove vulnerable in combat. Watts adjusted his oxygen mask and checked his guns. The hydraulic turret responded smoothly as he tracked the lead Focke-Wulf through his gun sight. What the approaching German pilots could not see from their cockpits, and what Luftwaffe intelligence had not yet fully comprehended, was that the Martin B-26 Marauder bristled with defensive armament that transformed it from a liability into one of the most heavily defended medium bombers in the European theatre. The aircraft mounted up to 12 50 caliber Browning machine guns, each capable of firing between 700 and 800 rounds per minute. The tail position alone, where Watts now sat, commanded an arc of fire that covered the Marauder's most vulnerable approach vector. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Focke-Wulf began its attack run. Watts opened fire at 800 yards, his tracers arcing through the cold air over the North Sea. The fundamental question that would be answered over the skies of Europe during the next 2 years was this: could an aircraft that killed its own crews during training prove effective against an enemy that had been refining air combat tactics since 1939? The answer would emerge not from engineering reports or tactical manuals, but from the accumulated experience of thousands of combat missions flown by crews who learned to trust an aircraft that their own military had nearly abandoned. The B-26's reputation had been established long before it ever encountered German fighters. The nickname Widowmaker originated not from enemy propaganda, but from American training bases where the aircraft's unforgiving flight characteristics killed crew after crew during the frantic pilot training programs of 1942. The Martin Company had designed the B-26 for speed, equipping it with powerful engines and short wings that generated high wing loading. This design philosophy created an aircraft that flew fast and carried substantial bomb loads efficiently, but demanded precise piloting during the critical phases of takeoff and landing. Inexperienced pilots transitioning from slower, more forgiving trainers found the Marauder would not tolerate the casual handling that other aircraft accepted. The accident rate during training became so severe that the entire B-26 program faced cancellation multiple times. Crews developed dark humor about the aircraft. One unofficial motto stated, "One a day in Tampa Bay," referring to the steady stream of fatal crashes at MacDill Field in Florida. The statistics supported the fear. During 1942, the B-26 experienced accident rates that exceeded 15% of the fleet in some training groups. Pilots died attempting to master an aircraft that required approach speeds exceeding 130 miles per hour, nearly 40 miles per hour faster than the B-25 Mitchell, the B-26's direct competitor for medium bomber missions. The Martin Company had designed the B-26 Marauder to fulfill specific performance requirements issued by the Army Air Corps in January 1939. The specification called for a medium bomber capable of carrying a 3,000-pound bomb load at speeds exceeding 300 miles per hour with a range exceeding 2,000 miles. Martin's design team, led by Peyton Magruder, created an aircraft optimized for these requirements through careful aerodynamic analysis and innovative engineering solutions. The resulting aircraft featured a circular cross-section fuselage that minimized drag, shoulder-mounted wings with relatively small surface area to reduce parasitic drag at high speeds, and two Pratt & Whitney R2800 double-wasp radial engines, each producing 1,900 horsepower. The wings measured 65 feet from tip to tip, but provided only 658 square feet of lifting surface. This created a wing loading of approximately 53 pounds per square foot in early production models, significantly higher than contemporary medium bombers. By comparison, the North American B-25 Mitchell featured wing loading of approximately 38 pounds per square foot, making it far more forgiving during slow-speed flight. The B-26's high wing loading meant the aircraft needed to maintain higher speeds throughout all phases of flight to generate sufficient lift. This fundamental aerodynamic reality created the handling characteristics that proved so deadly during training. Takeoff required long runways and precise technique. Pilots needed to accelerate the heavily loaded aircraft to approximately 120 miles per hour before rotation, maintaining careful control as the tail lifted and the aircraft transitioned from ground roll to flight. Any hesitation, any premature attempt to lift off, any loss of engine power during this critical phase would result in the aircraft settling back onto the runway, or worse, stalling immediately after becoming airborne at an altitude too low for recovery. Landing demanded even more precise execution. Pilots had to maintain approach speeds exceeding 130 miles per hour, far faster than the 85 to 95 miles per hour approaches that pilots learned on training aircraft. The B-26 would not tolerate the gradual, gentle flare that worked with slower aircraft. It required a specific technique executed at specific speeds. Deviation from these parameters resulted in stalls, spins, and crashes that killed entire crews. The accident rate during 1942 forced the Army Air Forces to confront a difficult decision. The B-26 program had consumed substantial resources, and Martin's production facilities in Baltimore and Omaha were producing aircraft at increasing rates. However, the training casualties threatened to undermine confidence in the entire medium bomber program. General Henry Arnold ordered investigations into the accidents. Some pilots blamed the aircraft design. Others pointed to inadequate training. The Senate Special Committee to investigate the National Defense Program, chaired by Senator Harry Truman, launched inquiries into whether the B-26 represented wasteful spending on a fundamentally flawed aircraft. Martin responded by modifying the design. Beginning with the B-26B model introduced in May 1942, the company increased the wingspan from 65 feet to 71 feet, adding wing area that reduced wing loading and improved low-speed handling characteristics. Later production blocks extended the wingspan further to 71 feet, providing additional margin during critical flight phases. The vertical stabilizer was enlarged to improve directional stability. These modifications helped reduce accident rates, though the B-26 continued demanding more skill than other medium bombers throughout its service life. While Martin engineers worked to improve the B-26's flight characteristics, operational planners confronted a different challenge. How to protect medium bombers operating at altitudes between 10,000 and 15,000 feet, where German fighters could intercept effectively and anti-aircraft fire remained accurate. The solution emerged through systematic addition of defensive armament that transformed the Marauder from a fast but vulnerable bomber into one of the most heavily defended aircraft in the medium bomber category. Early production B-26. Models featured relatively modest defensive armament, a single 50 caliber machine gun in the nose operated by the bombardier, one 50 caliber gun in a dorsal turret, one 50 caliber gun in each of two waist positions, and a single 30 caliber gun in the tail position. This armament proved inadequate during the first combat operations in the Southwest Pacific and North Africa during 1942. German and Japanese fighters discovered they could attack from ahead or astern with relative impunity, exploiting gaps in the defensive coverage. Combat experience drove rapid evolution of the defensive armament package. The B-26B introduced a power-operated Martin dorsal turret mounting twin 50 caliber guns, dramatically improving the ability to engage fighters attacking from above and behind. The tail position received a power-operated turret also mounting twin 50 caliber guns, eliminating the vulnerable single .30 caliber weapon that had proven ineffective against determined fighter attacks. Additional fixed .50 caliber guns were installed in the nose, aimed by the pilot to suppress anti-aircraft batteries during the bomb run and to engage fighters attacking from ahead. By 1943, late production B-26B and B-26C models mounted up to 12.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns distributed across multiple positions. The nose contained 4 fixed guns and 1 flexible gun operated by the bombardier. The dorsal turret mounted twin guns with 360-degree rotation capability. The tail turret mounted twin guns covering the critical rear hemisphere. Each waist position featured a flexible .50 caliber gun operated by gunners who could engage fighters attacking from the beam. This concentration of defensive firepower exceeded the armament carried by many heavy bombers early in the war. The .50 caliber Browning M2 machine gun represented mature technology refined through decades of development. Each weapon fired half-inch diameter projectiles weighing approximately 1.5 ounces at muzzle velocities exceeding 2,800 feet per second. The kinetic energy delivered by these projectiles proved devastating to aircraft structures. A sustained burst of .50 caliber fire could sever control cables, puncture fuel tanks, damage engines, or kill pilots through the relatively thin armor protection carried by German fighters. The effective range extended beyond 1,000 yards, though most engagements occurred at distances between 400 and 800 yards, where accuracy improved substantially. The 9th Air Force, activated in October 1942 and assigned to support tactical operations in Europe, became the primary operator of B-26 Marauders in the European theatre of operations. The 9th's medium bomber groups received their aircraft throughout 1943 and began operations against targets in occupied France, Belgium, and Holland. Unlike the 8th Air Force's heavy bombers, which struck deep into Germany at altitudes exceeding 25,000 feet, the 9th's Marauders operated at medium altitudes between 10,000 and 15,000 feet, attacking tactical targets including airfields, marshalling yards, bridges, and coastal defences. This operational profile placed Marauder crews directly in the engagement envelope where Luftwaffe fighters operated most effectively. German pilots could intercept at these altitudes without the oxygen system limitations and extreme cold that complicated high-altitude operations. Fighter attacks could be pressed closer because the shorter engagement times at medium altitude allowed pilots to close within effective gun range before breaking away. Anti-aircraft artillery, particularly the feared 88mm guns, achieved maximum effectiveness at the altitudes where Marauders operated, creating dense fields of lethal shrapnel that heavy bombers at higher altitude could avoid. The 9th Air Force developed specific tactical procedures to maximize the Marauders' defensive capabilities while minimizing vulnerability to fighters and flak. Bomber groups flew in tight formations called combat boxes, where individual aircraft positioned themselves to create overlapping fields of defensive fire. Each bomber's gunners could support adjacent aircraft, creating zones of concentrated .50 caliber fire that attacking fighters had to penetrate. The formation spacing allowed approximately 50 feet between wingtips, close enough for mutual support but distant enough to prevent collisions during evasive maneuvers or when aircraft sustained battle damage. Group commanders emphasized maintaining formation integrity above individual survival instincts. Isolated aircraft became easy prey for German fighters who recognized that a lone Marauder, despite its heavy armament, could be attacked from multiple vectors simultaneously, overwhelming the gunner's ability to engage all threats. Aircraft that fell out of formation due to battle damage, mechanical failure, or pilot error rarely survived if enemy fighters remained in the area. The cold mathematics of defensive firepower dictated that survival depended on mutual support, and mutual support required discipline to maintain position despite fear, fatigue, and the instinct to break away from danger. Crew training programs evolved to emphasize gunnery skills alongside the pilot training that had initially consumed most attention. Gunners attended specialized schools, where they learned to estimate range, calculate lead angles for deflection shooting, and maintain their weapons under combat conditions. Each gunner learned that the 50 caliber Browning required specific maintenance procedures to function reliably. The guns needed proper lubrication, regular inspection of ammunition belts for damaged rounds, and careful attention to barrel temperature during sustained firing. A jammed gun at the moment of fighter attack meant death, so gunners practiced malfunction clearance drills until the procedures became automatic reflexes. The bombardier in the nose position faced unique challenges. He operated a flexible 50 caliber gun while also serving as the primary navigator and bomb aimer during the final approach to target. The competing demands meant bombardiers needed exceptional ability to manage multiple critical tasks simultaneously while under fire. During the bomb run, which typically lasted 3 to 5 minutes, the aircraft flew straight and level to allow accurate bomb delivery. This predictable flight path gave anti-aircraft gunners optimal conditions for accurate fire. The bombardier had to ignore the bursting flak shells, operate his defensive weapon against fighter attacks, and guide the aircraft to the precise release point. The mental discipline required for this performance under extreme stress eliminated many candidates during training. Waist gunners, positioned on opposite sides of the fuselage, operated flexible 50 caliber guns mounted in rectangular window openings. They wore heavy fleece-lined leather suits because the open windows exposed them to temperatures that routinely dropped below -40 degrees Fahrenheit at operational altitude. The thin air at 12,000 feet made physical exertion exhausting. Swinging the heavy machine gun, loading fresh ammunition belts, and maintaining vigilance for attacking fighters required sustained physical effort at altitude where oxygen deprivation degraded performance. Luftwaffe fighter, pilots operating along the Channel coast and over occupied Western Europe during 1943 and 1944, faced tactical challenges markedly different from those encountered on the Eastern Front or in defense of the Reich against heavy bomber formations. Medium bombers like the B-26 Marauder presented specific engagement problems that required adapted tactics and careful execution. Unlike heavy bombers, which typically operated at altitudes where German fighters using single-stage superchargers struggled with reduced engine performance, medium bombers flew at altitudes where German fighters performed optimally. This altitude advantage, however, came with corresponding disadvantages that German pilots learned to respect through hard experience. The concentration of defensive firepower on late-model B-26 seconds surprised many German pilots who had developed tactics against earlier American bombers with less comprehensive defensive armament. Lieutenant Hans Hartigs, a pilot with Jagdgeschwader II based at Beaumont-le-Roger in Normandy during 1943, later described his first encounter with a Marauder formation in a post-war interview conducted by American interrogators. His account, preserved in captured Luftwaffe documents and interrogation records, provides insight into how German pilots assessed the threat posed by the heavily armed medium bombers. Hartigs recalled that intelligence briefings had emphasized the B-26's reputation as difficult to fly, noting the high training accident rates American units experienced. Some German pilots interpreted these reports as evidence that American crews lacked proper training or that the aircraft itself represented inferior design. This assessment proved dangerously incorrect during actual combat encounters. Hartigs described approaching a formation of 12 Marauders at 13,000 feet over Rouen in July 1943. His Focke-Wulf 190A5, armed with two 20mm cannon and two 13mm machine guns, possessed formidable offensive firepower. The standard German attack doctrine called for high-speed passes from advantageous angles, firing a concentrated burst at close range, before breaking away to avoid defensive fire and reset for another attack. Hartigs initiated his attack from the rear quarter, approaching from slightly below and to the side, where he expected minimal defensive coverage based on experience with earlier American bomber types. The Marauder tail turret opened fire at approximately 800 meters, far earlier than he anticipated. The twin 50 caliber guns produced a visible stream of tracer rounds that Hartigs described as surprisingly dense and accurate. He pressed his attack, closing to 400 meters before firing his cannon. His rounds struck the Marauder's left wing, but the return fire from multiple turrets forced him to break off the attack prematurely. His Focke-Wulf sustained hits in the left wing and fuselage. One .50 caliber round penetrated the cockpit, passing through the instrument panel and exiting through the canopy without striking Hartigs, though fragments from the shattered instruments caused minor facial lacerations. The engagement lasted approximately 30 seconds from initial contact to disengagement. Hartigs returned to base and reported his assessment. The Marauders' defensive armament proved more effective than intelligence reports suggested. The tail turret coverage eliminated the previously safe rear approach vector, and the formation discipline prevented isolation of individual bombers. He recommended that future attacks should employ coordinated approaches from multiple directions simultaneously to divide the defensive fire and overwhelm the gunner's ability to engage all threats. Other Luftwaffe pilots accumulated similar experiences throughout 1943 as B-26 groups expanded operations over occupied Europe. The Marauders' defensive firepower earned grudging respect from German fighter pilots who recognized that attacking these formations carried significant risk. Unlike the nickname Widowmaker, which American crews used with dark humor to describe training accidents, German pilots developed no specific derogatory nickname for the B-26. They referred to it simply as the Martin, acknowledging it as one of several American medium bomber types they encountered routinely. The tactical challenge German pilots faced when engaging Marauders stemmed from the fundamental trade-off between closing to effective gun range and accepting defensive fire. German 20mm cannon possessed superior destructive power compared to rifle-caliber machine guns, but effective range rarely exceeded 600 meters due to the relatively slow projectile velocity and pronounced bullet drop at longer distances. To employ cannon effectively, German pilots needed to close within the range where American 50 caliber machine guns operated at peak effectiveness. The 50 caliber projectiles traveled faster than 20mm shells, maintaining flatter trajectories that simplified aim at ranges exceeding 800 meters. The operational record compiled by B-26 groups operating from bases in England during 1943 and 1944 provides quantifiable evidence of the aircraft's effectiveness once crews mastered its demanding flight characteristics and employed it according to appropriate tactical doctrine. The 3rd Bombardment Wing, part of the 9th Air Force, operated B-26 groups exclusively and maintained detailed mission records that survived the war. These records document sortie rates, loss rates, bombing accuracy, and the progression of operational effectiveness as experience accumulated. The 322nd Bombardment Group, one of the first B-26 units to achieve operational status in the European theatre, flew its first mission against Luftwaffe airfields in Holland on May 14, 1943. The group's early missions experienced significant losses as crews learned tactical procedures and German defences adapted to the new threat. During May and June 1943, the group lost 12 aircraft during 54 missions, representing a loss rate exceeding 4% per mission. Such rates, if sustained, would exhaust the group's aircraft inventory within 25 missions, making sustained operations impossible. Group commanders analysed the losses and identified specific factors contributing to casualties. Isolated aircraft, whether through mechanical failure, battle damage, or pilot error, suffered disproportionate losses. Formations that loosened spacing to reduce collision risk inadvertently created gaps that German fighters exploited. Bombing altitudes below 10,000 feet exposed aircraft to light anti-aircraft fire that proved devastatingly effective. The analysis led to revised tactical procedures that emphasized maintaining tight formations, increasing bombing altitude where practical given target requirements, and implementing fighter escort coordination to suppress German interceptors during the vulnerable portions of missions. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The tactical adjustments produced measurable improvements in survival rates. By late 1943, loss rates for experienced B-26 groups had declined to approximately 1.5% per mission, representing a sustainable attrition rate that allowed groups to maintain operational strength while training replacement crews. The 386th Bombardment Group achieved particularly notable results, completing its first 100 missions by January 1944, while sustaining losses below 1% per mission. This performance demonstrated that properly employed B-26 seconds, flown by adequately trained crews, could survive the hostile environment over occupied Europe at acceptable cost. The bombing accuracy achieved by B-26 groups exceeded that of heavy bombers operating at higher altitudes, where thin air, extreme cold, and oxygen deprivation complicated the bombardier's task. Medium-altitude bombing from 12,000 feet allowed bombardiers to identify targets more easily, calculate ballistic solutions more accurately, and compensate for wind drift with greater precision. The 9th Air Force measured bombing accuracy using circular error probable, the radius of a circle within which 50% of bombs fell when aimed at a specific point. B-26 groups consistently achieved circular error probable measurements between 200 and 300 feet under combat conditions, compared to 400 to 600 feet for heavy bombers operating from 25,000 feet. This superior accuracy proved particularly valuable for tactical targets, where precision mattered more than total tonnage delivered. Bridges required direct hits to sever spans. Railroad marshalling yards demanded accurate placement to destroy switching facilities and block critical routes. Airfield attacks needed precision to crater runways at specific points that would prevent takeoffs while minimizing wasted bombs. The B-26's combination of defensive firepower for survival and medium-altitude accuracy for effective target destruction created an aircraft optimized for the tactical bombing mission, despite its notorious handling characteristics. The cumulative loss statistics compiled across all B-26 operations in the European theatre demonstrate the aircraft's ultimate vindication. From May 1943 through May 1945, 9th Air Force B-26 groups flew approximately 110,000 combat sorties and delivered more than 150,000 tons of bombs against tactical targets throughout occupied Europe and Germany. Total combat losses amounted to approximately 911 aircraft, representing a loss rate of approximately 0.83% per sortie. This rate compared favorably to heavy bomber loss rates and definitively contradicted the Widowmaker nickname that had nearly ended the program during training. The B-26 Marauder completed its transformation from the most feared aircraft in American training commands to one of the most respected tactical bombers in the European theatre, through the accumulated evidence of thousands of combat missions flown between May 1943 and the end of the war in May 1945. The aircraft that crews had called Widowmaker, that Senate committees had investigated as potential waste of resources, that training commands had grounded multiple times due to unacceptable accident rates, ultimately compiled the lowest loss rate of any American bomber type operating in the European theatre. This statistical achievement represented vindication not only of the aircraft design, but of the crews who mastered its demanding characteristics and the commanders who refused to abandon the program despite intense pressure. The operational statistics became impossible to ignore or dismiss. The final compilation of 9th Air Force records showed that B-26 groups sustained combat losses of less than 1% per sortie across all operations, from initial deployment through war's end. No other American bomber type, neither medium nor heavy, achieved comparable survival rates while conducting sustained combat operations over defended territory. The B-17 Flying Fortress, celebrated in popular culture and official propaganda as the aircraft that won the air war over Europe, sustained loss rates exceeding 2% per mission during portions of 1943 before fighter escort became available for deep penetration raids. The B-24 Liberator experienced similar or higher loss rates depending on target and period. Analyzed. The crews who survived B-26 training and went on to fly combat missions developed fierce loyalty to the aircraft they had initially feared. Pilot testimonials collected during and after the war consistently emphasized that once crews mastered the demanding takeoff and landing procedures, the Marauder proved to be a stable, reliable platform that brought them home despite battle damage that would have destroyed other aircraft. The robust construction philosophy that added weight and complicated handling characteristics also provided structural strength that absorbed punishment. Marauders returned to base with engines shot out, large portions of wing or tail surfaces destroyed, hydraulic systems failures, and extensive fuselage damage from flak or cannon fire. The aircraft's ability to sustain severe damage and continue flying saved countless crew lives. Technical Sergeant Robert Watts, the tail gunner introduced at the beginning of this account, survived the war after completing 65 missions with the 322nd Bombardment Group. His aircraft, Flakbait, became the most famous B-26 inches the European theatre, ultimately completing 207 combat missions, more than any other American aircraft in any theatre during World War II. The aircraft survived attacks by fighters, sustained flak damage on nearly every mission, and returned its crew safely despite accumulating more than 1,000 individual holes from enemy fire documented in maintenance records. Flakbait now resides in the collection of the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, preserved as testimony to the durability of Martin's design and the skill of the crews who flew it. The May 17, 1943 mission over IJmuiden, where Watts engaged the attacking Focke-Wulf fighters from his tail turret position, represented one engagement among thousands that demonstrated the effectiveness of the Marauders' defensive armament. The three attacking fighters that day broke off their attack after Watts's accurate fire damaged the lead aircraft and forced the formation to scatter. The mission proceeded to target without further fighter attacks. The group's bombers delivered their ordnance on the submarine pens at IJmuiden with good accuracy, contributing to the sustained campaign against German naval facilities along the occupied coastline. The mission exemplified the pattern that would repeat throughout the B-26's operational career: tight formation discipline, effective defensive gunnery, and accurate bombing despite opposition. The gradual shift in perception among Luftwaffe pilots operating against B-26 formations occurred through the same mechanism that transformed American crew attitudes: accumulated evidence that contradicted initial assumptions. German pilots who survived multiple encounters with Marauder formations learned to treat these aircraft with the same caution they applied when engaging other heavily defended bomber types. Intelligence reports compiled by Luftwaffe commands acknowledged that the Martin medium bomber possessed formidable defensive capabilities that made casual attacks inadvisable. Successful engagements required coordinated attacks from multiple directions, preferably with numerical superiority, and acceptance that casualties among attacking fighters would likely occur even during successful interceptions. The B-26's operational success emerged from the intersection of multiple factors that extended beyond the aircraft's design characteristics or defensive armament. The industrial capacity that produced Marauders in sufficient quantities to equip multiple bombardment groups represented a fundamental advantage that Germany could not match by 1943. Martin's two production facilities, the primary plant in Baltimore, Maryland, and the secondary facility in Omaha, Nebraska, together produced more than 5,000 B-26 seconds between February 1941 and March 1945. This production total exceeded the combined output of all German medium bomber types during the same period. The consistency of American production allowed standardization that simplified maintenance, training, and logistics. Replacement aircraft delivered to combat groups in 1944 featured the same systems, instruments, and equipment arrangements as the aircraft they replaced. Mechanics trained on early production models could maintain later versions without significant retraining. Spare parts inventories remained valid across production blocks. Crews transitioning from training aircraft to operational models encountered familiar cockpit layouts and procedures. These seemingly mundane logistical advantages accumulated to create operational effectiveness that exceeded what pure performance specifications suggested. German medium bomber production, by contrast, suffered from the resource constraints and strategic bombing campaign that progressively degraded German industrial capacity throughout 1943 and 1944. The Junkers Ju-88, Germany's primary medium bomber, experienced production disruptions as Allied bombing forced dispersal of manufacturing to smaller facilities, with less sophisticated equipment and less skilled labor. Quality control deteriorated, delivery schedules slipped. Spare parts became scarce as production prioritized complete aircraft over components needed to maintain existing inventory. The cumulative effect created maintenance problems that reduced operational availability even when sufficient aircraft existed on paper. The training infrastructure that prepared American B-26 crews also reflected industrial and organizational advantages that Germany could not replicate by mid-war. Despite the high accident rates that created the Widowmaker reputation, American training commands possessed sufficient aircraft, fuel, spare parts, and instructor pilots to sustain training programs that produced adequately prepared crews. Training bases in Florida, Texas, Louisiana, and other states operated continuously, gradually refining curricula to address the specific challenges posed by the B-26's handling characteristics. By late 1943, training procedures had evolved to emphasize the precise speed control and technique required for safe operations. Accident rates declined as instructors who had mastered the aircraft passed along specific procedures that worked. The fuel availability that American training enjoyed represented a critical advantage that became increasingly decisive as the war progressed. Aviation gasoline remained abundant in the United States throughout the war. Training flights could emphasize repetition until procedures became automatic. New pilots accumulated hundreds of hours of flight time before assignment to combat units. This thorough preparation contrasted sharply with Luftwaffe training programs by 1944, where chronic fuel shortages forced reduction of flight training hours to levels that left new pilots inadequately prepared for combat. German pilots arrived at operational units with minimal instrument time, limited formation experience, and insufficient gunnery training. They faced American crews who had received comprehensive preparation in all these areas. The maintenance support available to 9th Air Force B-26 groups stationed in England exemplified the logistical superiority that underpinned American operational effectiveness. Each group's maintenance sections possessed complete sets of specialized tools, adequate supplies of spare parts, technical manuals covering all aircraft systems, and experienced ground crews trained in standardized procedures. When aircraft returned from missions with battle damage, mechanics could typically restore them to flight-worthy condition within 24 to 48 hours, using available resources. Battle damage that exceeded field repair capabilities could be addressed at depot-level facilities in England, staffed by specialists with access to complete inventories of replacement components. The cumulative effect of these material advantages meant that B-26 groups could sustain high operational tempo despite combat losses and battle damage. Aircraft availability rates typically exceeded 70%, meaning that groups could launch missions using most of their assigned aircraft inventory. This readiness translated directly into striking power. Groups that could consistently put 30 aircraft over target applied more sustained pressure on German defenses than groups with superior aircraft performance but lower availability due to maintenance problems or spare parts. Shortages. The transformation of the B-26 Marauder's reputation from Widowmaker to one of the war's most effective tactical bombers illustrates how initial impressions, particularly negative ones formed during crisis, can persist despite contradictory evidence. The nickname coined during the desperate training accidents of 1942 remained associated with the aircraft throughout the war and into historical memory, even as the operational record compiled overwhelming evidence of the aircraft's effectiveness and survivability. Veterans who flew combat missions in Marauders spent decades after the war correcting misconceptions about the aircraft they had trusted with their lives. The persistence of the Widowmaker nickname reflects a broader pattern in how military equipment gains reputation. Dramatic failures, particularly those involving casualties during peacetime training, create lasting impressions that subsequent success struggles to overcome. The B-26 killed crews during training, under circumstances that generated extensive publicity, congressional investigations, and public concern about waste and mismanagement. These failures occurred at identifiable locations: MacDill Field in Florida, Barksdale Field in Louisiana, where local communities witnessed the crashes and mourned the dead. The aircraft's combat success, achieved gradually through thousands of missions over occupied Europe, generated far less dramatic evidence. Missions that succeeded became routine. Aircraft that returned safely represented expected outcomes rather than noteworthy achievements. The German perspective on the B-26, formed through combat encounters rather than training accidents, proved more accurately calibrated to the aircraft's actual capabilities. Luftwaffe pilots who survived engagements with Marauder formations recognized the defensive firepower and formation discipline as significant threats requiring careful tactical approach. They did not dismiss the aircraft as inferior or easily defeated. German after-action reports and tactical assessments treated the Martin medium bomber as a capable adversary, whose defensive armament demanded respect. This assessment, formed through direct combat experience, proved more reliable than American training narratives that emphasized the aircraft's unforgiving handling characteristics. The final irony of the B-26's service record emerges from comparing the training losses that created the Widowmaker nickname with the combat losses that vindicated the aircraft design. Estimates suggest that approximately 350 B-26 seconds were lost in training accidents within the United States during 1942 and 1943, killing over 1,000 crew members during the desperate expansion of pilot training programs. These losses, tragic and avoidable with better training procedures and more experienced instructors, created the reputation that nearly ended the program. The combat losses sustained by B-26 groups operating over Europe from May 1943 through May 1945 totaled approximately 911 aircraft, representing less than 1% loss per sortie across more than 110,000 combat missions against defended targets. The aircraft that killed crews during training because it demanded precise technique and would not tolerate casual handling proved remarkably survivable in combat when flown by crews who had mastered those demanding characteristics. The same design philosophy that created the high wing loading and fast approach speeds that caused training accidents also produced the speed and structural strength that allowed combat survival. The trade-offs that made the B-26 difficult to fly made it effective to fight. This fundamental relationship between handling difficulty and combat capability remained poorly understood during the training crisis, when pressure to abandon the program reached its peak. Technical Sergeant Robert Watts returned to civilian life after the war and rarely discussed his combat experiences in detail. He had witnessed crew members die in crashes during training at MacDill Field before his group deployed overseas. He had flown 65 combat missions over occupied Europe, engaging German fighters from his tail turret position and watching flak bursts bracket his formation. He understood through direct experience both sides of the Marauder's reputation. In the few interviews he granted to historians researching B-26 operations, Watts consistently emphasized that the aircraft brought him home when other aircraft would not have survived the damage his bomber sustained. The reputation as Widowmaker, he insisted, reflected training failures rather than design flaws. The crews who died during training deserved remembrance, but their deaths should not obscure the aircraft's combat record. The B-26 Marauder ended production in March 1945, as the war in Europe approached its conclusion. The final aircraft rolled off Martin's production lines and entered storage without seeing combat. The type was rapidly retired from service after war's end as the military establishment embraced jet propulsion and the new strategic doctrines of the atomic age. Few Marauders survived the mass scrapping of surplus aircraft during the late 1940s. Today, only a handful of B-26 seconds remain in museum collections, preserved as examples of a type that overcame its notorious reputation through the skill of the crews who flew it and the evidence of missions accomplished despite opposition. The Widowmaker that became a widow saver compiled its record through the unglamorous accumulation of successful missions, proving that reputation and reality sometimes travel separate paths until history forces their reconciliation. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.